The Victorians were an interesting people with a lot of interesting customs and practices and rules and etiquette. We associate them most with a very strict sense of good manners and dress and morality. And their whole society, and this is true in England and in the rest of Europe, but their entire society was really governed by a very strict set of morals and norms that had to do with one's gender and one's class. And these two are inextricably linked in Victorian society. So all these rules and ideas and customs, you have to keep in mind, have to do very much with what gender one was and what class one belonged to. Back during the late Enlightenment, Jean-Jacques Rousseau first spoke of what he defined as the spheres, the separate spheres of the man and the woman, that man and woman each had a separate place in society. And the Victorians, perhaps more than anyone else, embraced this ideal that the woman was for the home and the man was for the world. They enshrined this mentality and really venerated it, and more than anywhere else, this was apparent in the way that they treated their women. Now, you have to remember that gender and class were linked. So when we talk about the ideal Victorian woman, this woman was, of course, middle class or quite wealthy, the women who were held on a pedestal and held to this expectation in their society. Women were the keepers of the home, and their education was domestic. Now, this wasn't necessarily in how to cook or how to clean, but in how to manage a household and in how to keep a happy household. Women were educated to be good managers of the home. They were educated to be pleasing company to their husbands, and they were educated to be effective mothers for their children. In their practical education, this involved home economics. It also involved learning to play a musical instrument, to learn how to dance, to learn languages, etc. The spheres, especially as it pertained to women and especially as it pertained to middle class women, was all about what was deemed appropriate, what was appropriate for women. Talk of politics and talk of business, not appropriate for women. Talk of things that might be considered immoral, not appropriate for women, because middle class women especially were really kind of held on a pedestal. They were looked to for their morality and for their virtue. Women needed to be protected from the ugliness of the world. This is why you've often heard me say in class that the idea of a woman voting was funny. This is just not what women were meant to do or were made to do. They were gentle, they were fair, they were weak. They were very much in need of protection from the ugliness of the outside world. And so something like voting would be considered just blatantly inappropriate for a woman to do. Women were to cultivate their beauty, they were to wear good fashion, always to be pleasant, always to be pleasing, and using those good manners. The Victorians are very often associated in the popular culture with this sexual taboo, this idea that sex and sexuality were taboo topics. They were not to be discussed, they were not to be practiced, and actually that's not entirely true. They had quite a good sense of both sex and sexuality, but women, at least, this was something that would not have been discussed in front of them or would not have been considered appropriate for women, although sex, of course, was an obligation of a wife to her husband, but husbands were not to be too demanding. And Queen Victoria very famously told her eldest daughter upon her wedding day that night she should just lie back and think of England, and that was her education when it came to that. These ideas about the virtues of women and their very special role and place within the home and men's role and place outside of the home is called the cult of domesticity, that a good woman created and maintained a good home and was a model of virtue and raised good children for the society. Because of this idea, marriage was of the utmost importance. Now, marriage throughout history has always been a very important institution for women for economic purposes and for their economic survival, and that certainly remained very, very true. But the cult of domesticity and the idea of the spheres was so strong in Victorian England that making a good marriage and having a home was really very much tied up with a woman's identity, the same way that to have a job and have a purpose in the outside world is very tied up in a man's identity. So marriage was incredibly important, and the making of a good marriage was incredibly important. Even though women were considered fragile and it was considered inappropriate for them to work outside the home, especially after marriage, many women worked very hard. I would say most women, if not all women, worked very hard during this particular time. For wealthy women, this revolved around the management of a house, which would include a very large staff, of which the mistress, the lady of the house, would be the effective manager. Managing a home could be incredibly hard work, and for women who didn't have a staff to do everything, the work itself was very, very difficult. By the mid-19th century, especially in England, but also in other countries of Western Europe, the Factory Acts in England and legislation in other countries had really limited the ability of women to work in factories and to do other forms of industrial labor. Wages had also gone up, and this led to a really vast expansion of domestic service, of women who worked in domestic service, who worked in the homes of other men and women as servants, and for wealthier women to be the manager of these household staffs and servants. It was a good job for women to be able to do. In terms of that, it was respectable, and this was, again, for a rich woman, maintaining and managing the staff would have been her primary job. Many women in the Victorian times would have had servants, would have had domestic servants of some sort, even if they could not have a full staff. The wealthiest homes in Victorian society had full staffs, and a full staff would have come with its own social hierarchy. It would have had the housekeeper and the butler at the top, the personal servants of the master and the lady of the house, not far below them, and then a whole array of chambermaids and cooks and gardeners and stable boys, and finally women who were called scullery maids at the bottom. The scullery maids did the scrubbing. They did the most menial work. Most women could not afford, or most households, we should say, could not afford an entire staff, but many people had and kept domestic servants during the Victorian time period. In fact, people that today we might consider just soundly middle class or even lower middle class could have afforded to have one or more household servants. There was so much work to be done in the household that for most women, even if they had one or two domestic servants in their employ, there was still a lot of very, very hard work to do in the keeping and maintaining of the house. And so it's most appropriate to think that even though, according to the cult of domesticity and the spheres, women did work inside the home, women worked very, very hard. Overseeing the education and care of young children in middle-class and wealthy households was another job that very often fell to women. And this job often was the job of the governess. The governess would watch after the children and would sometimes see to their lessons while they were quite young, or to oversee their the completion of their lessons under a tutor. During Victorian times, in wealthier households, children were incredibly valued. During the 19th century, childhood really kind of came into its own as being seen as its own time period in life. And middle-class families during the 19th century, middle-class and wealthy families, really started to limit the number of children that they had. And they did this in order to really lavish more attention and love and to provide more for the children that they did have. And so during the early 19th century, and this is a trend that continued throughout the Victorian era, the birth rate declined pretty precipitously, especially in the higher socioeconomic classes. And so a governess would be a nanny and teacher to the children of a middle class or a wealthy household. Being a governess was a respectable job for an educated but unmarried woman. Marriage is so important in this whole society, and in what it was considered appropriate or inappropriate for a woman to do. And although children were valued, they were to be, quote, seen and not heard. So it was the job of the governess to kind of make sure that that happened. Children were not to speak unless they were spoken to. Obedience to parents was incredibly important, etc. For the poor, life remained very hard. In the coming days, we'll talk about the working class and how their life generally improved, but for the poor, life remained very hard. The cities were dirty, they were crowded, the areas where the poor lived remained in pretty bad shape, and there were large numbers of people in the Victorian cities who lived on the street, who had to scavenge in garbage for food to eat, who did not have enough work to do, and this would be especially true in times of economic downturn or recessions, etc. The Victorians viewed the poor as the criminal class, and this is very telling that to the middle class Victorians, those who lived in poverty were by definition criminals, that people who were poor chose a life of idleness and crime over one of productivity and virtuous living, and they generally held them responsible for their own situation. Orphanages were in high demand, foundling homes as they were called, because very often the child was abandoned, the child was not truly orphaned in the pure definition of the word. These foundling homes, these orphanages, were often pretty miserable places, but they were meant to try to keep kids, poor kids, off of the street. And they were a favorite charity of middle-class women. The middle class believed that the poor had no control over themselves, that they were really unable to control their impulses to steal, to control their impulse to drink, to control their sexual impulses, and they accused them of like breeding like rats. So they had too many children, and that's why, you know, that contributed to their poverty and why the foundling homes were necessary, etc. So it was a pretty bad situation, and there was a lot of petty crime in Victorian Europe, what we would call petty crime, a lot of pickpocketing, a lot of stealing, that kind of stuff. And so, you know, the rich kind of looked at the poor and they thought, oh, the criminal class. And of course, people who were poor made a lot of bad choices then, as they might do now. But certainly their lives could be quite desperate and quite difficult and quite miserable. In order to keep the poor off of the streets, the British really became quite expert at the operation of what were called poor houses. And poor houses were simply a way back in the Victorian times to deal with the homeless population. This is not a problem that we have yet figured out. And so in many Victorian cities, London, Paris, etc., what they called vagrancy was illegal. And vagrancy is just hanging out on the street and staying on the street. And so people who were hanging out on the street would be rounded up and they would be put into these poor houses. And the whole point of the poorhouse was to make one so miserable that they would then choose not to be poor, but would choose to go and get a job and become a productive member of society. If only these problems were so easy to solve. This certainly was a big problem at the time. The poor laws which established these poor houses, the people who were rounded up and were sent to them, they were often whipped, they were fed very poor rations of food, and they were, again, generally made to be miserable. And this was intentional. The whole idea was to take the person who is, seen by the society as generally being idle and perhaps having criminal tendencies, that their life could be much less miserable if they would just get a job. Okay, you can see here in this picture a group of working women. These women worked in the mining industry. Many women did still work in industry, even though the kind of jobs that they were able to do were much curtailed. Many women in the poor working classes had to work even after they were married, and this really was considered something of a shame. I guess that I would say it was kind of a shameful thing. But for many women, they continued to have to work, and if they couldn't get a job in domestic service, or they couldn't get a job in industry, there weren't very many acceptable avenues of work, I guess I should say, open to them. This drawing is probably kind of hard to see, but here's a working class woman, should say a poor woman. What many poor women were forced to do during the Victorian era, which was simply to sell things. And many women have had to do this in all different eras of time, to sell herbs, to sell medicine, to sell vegetables, to sell flowers, to sell themselves. Prostitution remained a thriving industry in the Victorian society, especially in the cities. And so women who sold things on the street, not in shops, but on the streets, this woman is selling vegetables, flowers, themselves, etc., were usually women who had no other options and were in the most desperate kind of need to survive. It's important to note that poor women were not put on the pedestal with middle class or wealthy women. They weren't held up to a higher standard. They weren't regarded as too virtuous and too good for the outside world, for the ugliness of the outside world. They weren't protected from things the way that wealthy women were. Their entire lives were different, and not only the reality of their lives, but the expectations of them and the way that they were viewed, and of course the way then that they were treated.